Porfiriato left a historical record of organized theft disguised as official policy. The Mexican elite classes, to this day, have a disdain for the Mexican working poor, and it is reflected in their economic negotiations with Wall Street. Now, what can be said about Mexican politics in the 19th century? It is filled with violence, loss of territory, occupation, political deception, and Anglo intrigue. As modernization, industrialization, immigration, urbanization, and economic growth exploded after the Civil War in the United States and after the French occupation in Mexico, farmers, workers, immigrant laborers, and native irredentist movements on both sides of the border called for the overthrow of monopoly and capitalism in both countries. Now, as we have witnessed in the presentation on the white beans on the European immigration to the United States, contradictions accompanied the rise of, or the emergence of modernity, with rising wealth and productivity on the one hand and increasing polarization of incomes and power on the other. So the demands for federal regulation and notions of government regulation of corporate power emerged in the late 19th century and consumed the political debates at the turn of the century in both Mexico and the United States. The rise of industrial capitalism rested on the conversion of millions of people into wage laborers. And this transformation, this experience transformed their lives. And in the United States, movements for change were identified as the populist movement and progressive reform. Well, in Mexico, it became known as La Revolución. In Europe, the transformation from feudalism to capitalism completes its final phase in World War I. But the Porfiriato in Mexico was violent. The advance of civilization through modernization, urbanization, immigration, and industrialization came at the expense of working class, of the farmers, of peasants. Wealth, political power, and access to education were concentrated amongst the few, similar to the United States. And overwhelmingly, people of European descent controlled both wealth and the governmental decision-making power in Mexico. In Mexico, foreign companies linked through Wall Street and headquartered in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Austin, in London, in Paris, and Amsterdam, they exercise power in Mexico. Take a look at Wrigley's. Wrigley's, we know about Wrigley's Spearmint Gum. It operated in the Yucatan Peninsula. And of course, that's where the Chicago Cubs come from. Randolph Hearst's New York News Services controlled agricultural output in Mexico's northern states of Chihuahua and Durango. Randolph Hearst owned 32 haciendas. Phelps Dodge Copper Refinery, along with Kennecott Copper and Ozarko, controlled mineral production along the border states of the southwest U.S. and northern Mexico. And then Los Angeles here had a construction company known as the Richardson Construction Company that controlled the agricultural output of Mexican states of Sonora and Sinaloa. Now, these were just a few of the many corporations that were controlling the wealth of Mexico. So at the turn of the century, Native peoples' resistance movements challenged the dictatorship and in the process sparked a revolution. Whereas in the United States, the assassination of the president is going to spark progressive reform, in Mexico, Mayan people from the Yucatan Peninsula are going to rebel against the against their unfair labor practices in the Hennepin plantations that were run by Wrigley. And then the Yaqui people from the states of Sonora and Sinaloa are going to resist the land encroachments from the Los Angeles Richardson Construction Company. But Porfirio Diaz, what he's going to do is ruthlessly put down these rebellions, capturing Mayans and sending them as enslaved workers to Sonora and Sinaloa. And then he's going to capture Yaquis and send them as enslaved workers to the Yucatan. So when we take a look at the Mexican Revolution has many characters and movements for change. And nearly every Mexican family living in the United States has a personal story about relatives and their experiences in the Revolution. At least every Mexican family that came through during the Revolution. And the ultimate cost of the Revolution was the loss in lives. Approximately 2.1 million people died between 1910 and 1920. So just 100 years after Hidalgo's September 16th Grito de Dolores that emphasized Mexica, 100 years, the carnage begins when Francisco Madero declared Díaz's regime illegal on November 20th, 1910. Nearly every racial and class interest participated in revolutionary struggle to create a just society. Let's take a look at the government-sponsored infomercial as Mexico celebrated the 100-year anniversary of the revolution on November 20th, 2010.
As the first decade of the 20th century progressed, discontent with the government of Porfirio Díaz began to spread throughout the country. During his time in office, key principles such as social justice and the exercise of democracy had been ignored.
The Mexican Revolution. In 1908, Porfirio Díaz announced that he would retire from power at the end of his term because he believed that Mexico was ready for democracy. This statement unleashed a political fervor throughout the country.
In his book, The Presidential Succession in 1910, Francisco y Madero set forth the need for a peaceful and democratic change. In 1909, he began to travel around the country, spreading a message that took root in the civic consciousness of the Mexican people: effective suffrage, no re-election.
As Madero's popularity increased, the government had him arrested. He was still in prison when the presidential elections were held, and Porfirio Díaz was elected for the 7th time.
Madero was able to escape, and he issued the Plan of San Luis, calling the election null and void and urging the people to take up arms for the cause of democracy.
The revolution erupted on November 20th, 1910. Peasants, laborers, miners, intellectuals, and the middle class joined the fight.
When the revolutionary forces occupied Ciudad Juárez, the government was forced to sign a peace treaty. Porfirio Díaz resigned the presidency and went into exile.
Madero made his triumphal entry into Mexico City. However, as the victor, he did not simply take over as president. He waited for new elections so that he could legitimately claim the presidency through the will of the citizens.
But Mexico continued to experience very difficult times, economically, socially, and politically.
In Morelos, Zapata's followers believed that Madero didn't support their struggle for land, and they issued the Plan de Ayala against him.
To the north, Pascual Orozco rose up in arms to defend the people's demands.
Meanwhile, prominent members of the old regime organized the overthrow of Madero's government.
President Madero put General Victoriano Huerta in charge of defending his government, but Huerta entered into negotiations with the opposing group and supported the coup d'etat.
Madero was forced to resign, and Huerta assumed the presidency. The 10 tragic days ended with the death of Madero.
Venustiano Carranza, the governor of Coahuila, repudiated Huerta and issued the Plan of Guadalupe in order to restore constitutional order.
The country became a battlefield on which the constitutionalists fought the federal army. After more than a year of intense fighting, the constitutionalists forced Huerta to resign.
But the revolutionaries' victory did not solve the nation's enormous problems of democracy, social justice, land ownership, jobs, and education.
The followers of Carranza, Villa, and Zapata all wanted to be the ones to decide the country's course. As they were not able to come to an agreement, the revolution split into various factions.
At the Aguascalientes Convention, the followers of Villa Zapata imposed their views, which focused more on social policy. The convention declared itself sovereign and repudiated Carranza.
Carranza moved his government to Veracruz and, starting in 1915 and supported by Obregon's troops, began an intense military campaign against Villa and Zapata.
With the military situation going his way, Carranza calls on Congress to draft a new constitution. It was adopted on February 5th, 1917.
Although different factions continued to vie for power, the Constitution opened the way for the country in the years following the Revolution by including the principles for which the country had fought: democracy, education, agrarian reform, and labor rights. Bicentennial of Independence, Centennial of the Mexican Revolution.
Okay, so when we take a look at the 19th century history and the early 20th century history of Mexicans, it is filled with violence. Mexico and Mexicans will not know peace between 1810 and 1920. There's Mexican independence. There's the Alamo. There's the Texas question. There's the annexation of Texas. There's the U.S. war with Mexico. There's the French occupation. There's the movement to oust the French. There's the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, known as the Porfiriato, and then there's the Mexican Revolution. So for over 100 years, Mexico and Mexicans will experience calamities, setbacks, intense struggles, and most importantly, tremendous territorial loss. Mexican history is incredibly amazing given the adversity, because every struggle reveals the dance of good against evil, of anti-democratic forces pitted against progressive reform, of that eagle devouring the snake perched on a cactus. So again, let's understand, once the United States takes over, the Mexican migration experience turns into immigration. So we need to appreciate the fact that the basic work activities for Mexicanos when the United States takes over is going to continue when the United States takes over and the United States industrializes. And those basic work activities are agriculture, livestock raising, artisan production, mining, and transportation industries. Agricultural work was the most basic. So let's get to understand that, the roots of the brown beans, the experience of the brown beans. Next week we'll continue for the 20th century. Thank you.